Some stories in country music break your heart clean in half and leave you standing there, holding the pieces, wondering what could have been. Keith Whitley is one of those stories, and I want to be careful with that sentence, because I have heard people say it about him before in that exact tone. The tragic country star, the wasted potential, the voice we lost too soon. And while all of that is true, none of it comes close to capturing what the loss of Keith Whitley actually means if you really sit with it. If you stop treating him as a footnote to a cautionary tale and start treating him as what he actually was, which is one of the most naturally gifted country music singers who ever drew breath on this earth. I've been thinking about how to open this video for a while now, because there is a version of the Keith Whitley story that country music has been telling for 35 years, and it goes like this. Brilliant voice, crippling alcoholism, died too young, what a shame. And that version is not wrong. It just isn't the whole story. It doesn't tell you where he came from or what he had to become before Nashville would look at him, or what it actually sounded like when he opened his mouth and sang, or what the morning of May 9th, 1989 looked like before everything went wrong. So that is the version we are going to tell today. All of it. Keith Whitley grew up in Sandy Hook, Kentucky. I want you to hold that for a second. Sandy Hook, Kentucky, because the place matters. This is not a metaphor or a colorful detail. Eastern Kentucky in the 1950s and 1960s was a specific world with a specific music and a specific understanding of what singing was for. The mountains closed in on all sides. The coal mines ran under everything. The church was at the center of every community and the music that came out of those communities. Bluegrass, old time, the mountain ballads that had been passed down for generations without anyone writing them down. That music was not entertainment. It was identity. It was how people told each other who they were. Keith Whitley absorbed all of that from the time he was old enough to hear it. His father, Elmer, was an electrician. His mother, Faye, played multiple instruments and encouraged her children to play alongside her from the time they could hold anything resembling an instrument. Keith won a local talent contest at age 6. His father, in the specific way that fathers in that part of the world express love, through action rather than declaration, went out and bought him his first guitar as a result. By the time Keith was 8 years old, he was on the radio. Not in Nashville, on WCHS in Charleston, West Virginia, singing Hank Williams' You Win Again like a boy who had been born knowing what that song meant. Think about that for a moment. 8 years old, singing Hank Williams on the radio in West Virginia with the confidence and the emotional grasp that most grown adults never develop. There are people who spend their entire lives chasing what Keith Whitley had naturally at 8 years old. By the time he was 13, he had formed his first band with his brother Dwight. By 15, he had connected with a boy his own age from Lawrence County, Kentucky, named Ricky Skaggs, and the two of them together became something extraordinary. Two teenage boys playing Stanley Brothers songs in a part of the country where the Stanley Brothers were not just musicians, but something closer to cultural saints. They called themselves the Lonesome Mountain Boys. They built a local following. They practiced constantly. They knew every note of every Ralph Stanley record ever pressed. And then Ralph Stanley found them. The story of how Ralph Stanley discovered Keith Whitley and Ricky Skaggs is one of those country music stories that sounds too good to be true and happens to be completely accurate. Stanley and his band, the Clinch Mountain Boys, were driving through Fort Gay, West Virginia one night when they blew a tire near a little beer joint called Jim and Faye's. While the tire was being dealt with, Stanley walked into the bar to wait. Inside that bar, two teenage boys were playing Stanley Brothers songs, not covering them loosely, not doing a reasonable approximation, playing them with the kind of precision and devotion that you only develop when you have listened to something so many times that it has become part of how you breathe. Ralph Stanley stood there and listened. When they finished, he introduced himself. As if two boys who had been playing his songs since they were old enough to hold an instrument needed any introduction. He told them he was rebuilding the Clinch Mountain Boys following the death of his brother Carter. He asked them if they wanted to come play with him. Keith Whitley was 15 years old. He said yes without hesitating. What followed were the years that made Keith Whitley the singer he became. Touring with Ralph Stanley in the early 1970s, sleeping in the van, playing schoolhouses and church basements and small venues across the Appalachian region, learning what it meant to deliver a song to people who had come specifically to feel something rather than to be entertained. The Stanley Brothers tradition was not about showmanship. It was about truth. You opened your mouth and you told the truth about what it felt like to be a human being. The grief and the faith and the loneliness and the love. And if you did it right, the people in the room felt less alone. Keith Whitley learned that lesson so completely that it became impossible to separate it from who he was as a singer. Every record he ever made carries it. Every note of every vocal performance he gave in Nashville carries it. You cannot listen to Keith Whitley and not feel like you are being spoken to directly. Not performed at, spoken to, by someone who means every single word. He spent several years with Ralph Stanley, then joined J.D. Crowe and the New South in 1978, which was one of the most progressive and exciting bluegrass outfits in the country at that time. He was in his early 20s. His reputation in the bluegrass world was already substantial. People who followed that music knew exactly who Keith Whitley was and what his voice could do. But Keith Whitley wanted country music, not bluegrass. Country. The Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell and George Jones and Merle Haggard. Music that he had grown up loving alongside the Stanley brothers. He wanted to make records in Nashville and put them on the radio and reach the audience that he felt, with a certainty that was apparently bone deep from the very beginning, was waiting for exactly what he had to offer. He moved to Nashville in 1983. He was 28 years old. He had spent nearly half his life on the road and on stages and in recording sessions, and he arrived in Nashville not as a raw beginner, but as a fully formed artist who knew exactly what he was and exactly what he wanted to do. The problem was that Nashville in 1983 was not entirely sure it wanted what he was offering. The early to mid-1980s in country music were a complicated time for a man who sounded like Keith Whitley. The urban cowboy era had smoothed everything out. The production values that were dominating country radio were slick and pop-adjacent and not particularly interested in the raw, unguarded, emotional directness that Whitley brought to every song he sang. He was too real, too much, too honest. Country radio in 1983 was not particularly interested in too honest. He signed with RCA Records, which was genuinely significant. RCA was one of the most important country labels in Nashville, and signing there meant somebody believed in what he was doing. But the early records did not immediately take off the way they should have. His debut album, L.A. to Miami, came out in 1985 and produced a top 20 hit in Miami, Miami, but did not make him the star that his talent demanded he become. The production on those early records was fighting his voice rather than serving it. The label still trying to figure out what to do with a man who sounded like he had walked directly out of 1959 into a recording studio that was trying to sound like 1985. Here is where producer Garth Fundis enters the story, and he is the person that Keith Whitley needed to find. When Whitley was not happy with the first version of what would become his second album, RCA gave him the unusual gift of starting over with a different producer. Fundis came in and listened to what Whitley could actually do. Not what the label wanted him to do. Not what was charting that week, but what happened when this specific voice was given material that matched its emotional range and a production environment that got out of its way. Fundis sent Whitley a tape of songs. On that tape was a Bob McDill ballad called Don't Close Your Eyes. Bob McDill had written the song 5 years before anyone recorded it. He got the idea from a scene in a 1978 Neil Simon film called California Suite, where Maggie Smith's character, knowing that her companion fantasizes about someone else, says to him in a moment of terrible vulnerability, "Tonight, don't close your eyes." McDill took that image, that specific, unbearable request of someone who loves a person they cannot quite reach, and built a song around it. He sat on it for 5 years. Nobody recorded it. And then it ended up on a tape that landed in Keith Whitley's hands in 1987. Whitley heard it and knew, not thought it might work. Knew. The way singers who are connected to something real know when a song belongs to them. He co-produced the album with Fundis, and they recorded Don't Close Your Eyes with a stripped-back, honest production that put his voice exactly where it needed to be. Front and center, nothing between it and the listener. Nowhere to hide and no desire to hide. The first 3 singles from that album were Don't Close Your Eyes, When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain. All 3 went to number 1, all 3 in a row, one after the other. His first number 1, his second number 1, his third number 1. Billboard named Don't Close Your Eyes the number 1 country single of the entire year, 1988. He won CMA Single of the Year for I'm No Stranger to the Rain in 1989, the first and only major CMA award of his career. He was 33 years old. He had been in Nashville for 6 years. He had waited longer than most men would have waited. And now, the radio was playing his voice every hour, and people who had never followed country music closely were pulling over to the side of the road to listen to him finish a song. He was exactly where he had always known he would end up. And the drinking was going to take it all away. Now. I want to be careful here too, because the drinking is the part of Keith Whitley's story that tends to become the whole story, and I do not think that serves him well. But I also think that avoiding it, softening it, or addressing it in the comfortable language of tragedy and addiction without looking at its specific, lived reality, That does not serve him well either. He deserves the truth told plainly. He told the plain truth in every song he ever made. The least we can do is extend him the same courtesy. Keith Whitley started drinking when he was a teenager on the bluegrass circuit. He said so himself in an interview with the Chicago Tribune that has been quoted many times since because of how honest and how heartbreaking it is. He said, "I learned to do things the way the old timers did it. I thought everybody had to drink to be in this business. Lefty drank, Hank drank, George Jones was still drinking, and I had to. That's just the way it was. You couldn't put that soul in your singing if you weren't about 3 sheets in the wind." That quote tells you something important. Not that the belief was correct, it wasn't. But it tells you that the drinking was not casual. It was not recreational. It was something he had built his entire understanding of artistry around from the time he was a teenager in a musical tradition that had, unfortunately, modeled exactly that understanding for him through the careers of the people he admired most. Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzell, George Jones, every one of them legendary, every one of them fighting the same thing. He survived a car crash at high speed as a teenager. He drove a car off a cliff into a frozen river, walked away with a broken collarbone. His brother Randy died in a motorcycle accident in 1983. The recklessness ran in the family the way certain things run in families, not because anyone chose it, but because it was part of the water they all drank from. He met Lorrie Morgan on the road, 2 young country music artists crossing paths in the specific way that touring musicians cross paths, in venues and backstage hallways and long drives between shows. They married in 1986. Lorrie was already a Grand Ole Opry member, one of the youngest in the institution's history. She was talented, ambitious, building her own career, and she loved Keith Whitley completely and with full knowledge of what she was signing up for. She has spoken about those years in interviews that are difficult to read without your chest tightening. She said she knew going in. She said she thought that her love would be enough to help him. She said she believed that being there, being present, keeping the environment as stable as possible would hold him together in ways that nothing else had managed to. She hid alcohol from him throughout their marriage. At some point, and this is the detail that lands the heaviest of anything I have read about their relationship, she began binding their legs together with a belt before they went to sleep at night, so that if he got up in the middle of the night to drink, she would feel it and wake up. She bound their legs together. Think about what that image represents. Not just the desperation of it, the love of it. A woman so determined to keep this man alive that she tied herself to him in the dark so she would know the moment he moved toward the thing that was killing him. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of love that asks everything of a person and gives everything back. And she was right that she was keeping him alive. She said so herself. "I feel in my own heart I kept Keith alive a lot longer because I was there all the time." She put her own career on hold, repeatedly, substantially, in the specific way that only someone who loves another person more than they love their own ambitions can manage, to be there for him. In early May of 1989, Lorrie Morgan had professional commitments that required her to be on the road. Her debut solo album on RCA Records, Leave the Light On, was about to come out, and she had promotional tour dates booked. She was already a member of the Grand Ole Opry. She was launching her own career at a significant moment, and she had to go. She drove to the airport. Keith drove her. He dropped her off. He watched her go through those doors. And then he went home to the house in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, which is a suburb just north of Nashville, and Lorrie Morgan was not there. She has never said explicitly and publicly exactly what happened in the days between her departure and the morning of May 9th. What is known is that he was not alone the whole time. There were people around, and by some accounts, the weekend involved drinking with others before the final solitary stretch. What is documented is that by the morning of May 9th, he had been drinking for days. At some point that morning, he called his mother. We know that. They spoke briefly. He was coherent enough to have a conversation on the phone. His brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, came by the house. The two of them sat and had coffee together. They made plans for the day: golf, lunch, a normal Tuesday. Keith mentioned that he was going to spend the afternoon writing songs. Not just for himself. Songs for him and Lorrie to record together when she got back. He was making plans for the afternoon. He was writing songs in his head for his wife to sing. Lane Palmer left the house around 8:30 in the morning. He told Keith to be ready to leave within the hour for golf. When he came back, Keith Whitley was face down on his bed, fully clothed, unresponsive. An ambulance was called. He was taken to the hospital. He was pronounced dead. The medical examiner's report stated that his blood alcohol concentration at the time of death was 0.47. To put that number in context, the legal driving limit in Tennessee at that time was 0.10. 0.47 is nearly 5 times that. The medical examiner said it was the equivalent of approximately 20 shots of 100 proof whiskey. At that blood alcohol concentration, the body cannot maintain the basic functions that keep a person alive. The heart and lungs simply stop being able to do what they need to do. He was 33 years old. His last #1 single, I'm No Stranger to the Rain, had reached the top of the chart exactly 1 month before he died. 1 month. He had just received his first CMA award for that song. He was at the precise moment when everything he had worked for and waited for was finally arriving. And then it was over. The day after he died, Music Row in Nashville was lined with black ribbons. 500 people came to his funeral on May 12th. Ricky Skaggs was there. The boy who had stood beside him in that beer joint in Fort Gay, West Virginia, playing Stanley Brothers songs until Ralph Stanley walked through the door and changed both of their lives. Every major figure in country music came or sent word. Because country music knew what it had lost, even if the rest of the world was still catching up. Here's what I want you to sit with, because there is something about the Keith Whitley story that I think does not get said clearly enough, and it is this. The songs that were #1 when he died were not flukes. They were not the accidental result of good timing or clever marketing or a producer making the right calls in the studio. They were the product of a man who had been developing his voice and his understanding of what a country song could do for 20 years before Nashville paid attention. The specific emotional directness that made Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All and I'm No Stranger to the Rain feel different from everything else on the radio in 1988. That quality did not come from a recording studio in Nashville. It came from the mountains of eastern Kentucky, from Ralph Stanley's van, from 10,000 nights on stages that most people who talk about country music have never heard of. When you hear Keith Whitley sing, you are hearing everything that came before Nashville. You're hearing Sandy Hook and the Clinch Mountain Boys and the beer joint in Fort Gay and the years of driving and playing and absorbing the specific musical tradition of Appalachian country music until it lived inside him so completely that no amount of smooth Nashville production could push it out. That is why the voice sounds the way it sounds. That is why 40 years after those records were made, people still pull them up and feel something they cannot quite name. Because Keith Whitley was not performing emotion. He was transmitting it from somewhere real, through a microphone, into the ears of strangers who heard it and felt less alone. Garth Brooks has cited him as a primary influence. Alan Jackson has cited him. Tim McGraw, Dierks Bentley, Blake Shelton. These are not small names. These are the people who defined what country music sounded like for the 20 years after Keith Whitley died. And they will tell you without hesitation that his voice was part of what showed them what the music could be. At the 50th CMA Awards in 2016, Garth Brooks performed Don't Close Your Eyes. Lorrie Morgan was in the audience. She sat there and listened to one of the biggest stars in country music history sing her late husband's signature song in front of the entire industry. Garth Brooks, who had once called himself a superfan of Keith Whitley, who had said that Whitley's voice was unlike anything he had ever heard, standing on that stage, singing that song to the woman who had spent 3 years trying to keep the man alive. I do not have language adequate to the weight of that moment. His gravestone at Spring Hill Cemetery outside Nashville carries 2 inscriptions. The first reads, "Forever yours faithfully." The second reads, "His being was my reason." Lorrie chose both. The first refers to Keith. The second refers to her. She has a burial plot reserved beside him. She has never remarried. I want to close this video with a question that I have been sitting with for a long time, and it is a question that does not have a comfortable answer, but which I think anybody who loves this music has to reckon with at some point. What would the 1990s have sounded like with Keith Whitley in them? Garth Brooks changed what country music looked like in 1989 and 1990. Randy Travis had already changed what it sounded like a few years before that. Alan Jackson arrived in 1990 and established himself as one of the defining traditional voices of the decade. The neo-traditional movement that Keith Whitley had been a part of building in the late 1980s went on to produce some of the finest music the genre has ever made. But Keith Whitley was not there for any of it. He was gone at 33 with 2 studio albums to his name and 3 #1 singles and a voice that every one of the artists who succeeded him in the following decade cited as part of what they were reaching for. What does an artist like that produce when the career keeps going? When the voice matures and deepens? When the life experience and the craft and the specific emotional intelligence that was already producing music of that quality at 33 gets another decade? 2 decades, a full career to work with? We do not know. We cannot know. And that is the specific, particular grief of the Keith Whitley story that never fully leaves the people who loved his music. Not just that he died young, but that the best was still ahead of him. Alan Jackson said it. Garth Brooks said it. Ricky Skaggs, who was there from the very beginning, standing beside him when Ralph Stanley walked through that door in Fort Gay. Skaggs said it. The people who knew what Keith Whitley was capable of all said the same thing in different words. He was just getting started. The voice on those records is the voice of a man who had not yet reached his ceiling. And that is the thing that stays with you after the grief and the story and the tragedy have settled. Not what was lost, what was still being made. Go listen to When You Say Nothing at All tonight, not as background music. Sit down with it. Give it the 4 minutes it takes. Listen to what he does with his voice in the space between the lines. The restraint of it, the control, the way he holds back just enough that when he does let it go, even slightly, it hits you somewhere deep and doesn't let go. That is what the bluegrass tradition taught him. That is what Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys and 20 years on the road before Nashville ever knew his name built inside him. That voice belonged to all of us, and we did not get nearly enough of it. Leave a comment below and tell me when you first heard Keith Whitley. Tell me which song it was. Tell me if you think country music has ever fully come to terms with what it lost on May 9th, 1989. Or if it just kept moving the way the music business always keeps moving, because it doesn't know how to stop. Because I think about that question more than I probably should. Thank you for watching.